The stars stretched endlessly before the USS Defiance as it moved through the dark void of space toward the gathering point in the Epsilon sector. Commander Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the viewport display dozens of alien warships that hung in formation like predators waiting for prey. His ship was smaller than most of them and looked plain compared to their glowing shields and ornate hull designs. The year was 2347, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Coalition for only 3 years. 3 years was nothing to civilizations that had sailed the stars for thousands of generations. To them, humanity was new and untested and possibly weak. Lieutenant Karen Bishop sat at her tactical station and monitored the communication channels that buzzed with alien chatter. Most of it was in languages that the translation software converted into something the human crew could understand. Much of what she heard made her jaw tighten with anger. The aliens were talking about the Defiance, and none of it was respectful. They called it a toy boat and a scout vessel, and questioned why humanity had even bothered to send something so pathetic to a military exercise. Karen glanced back at Commander Hayes, but his weathered face showed nothing. He simply watched the gathering fleet and waited. The largest ship in the formation belonged to the Korvax Empire. It was called the Eternal Dominion, and it stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern. Its hull bristled with plasma cannons and energy projectors that could probably tear a moon apart. Standing on its bridge was Admiral Zekthor, who commanded not just his own fleet but had taken charge of this entire exercise. Zekthor was a towering reptilian creature with 4 arms and scales that shimmered like polished copper. He had fought in wars that lasted longer than human civilization had existed. When his crew informed him that the human vessel had arrived, he made a sound that the translator interpreted as laughter. He ordered his communications officer to broadcast a message on an open channel where everyone could hear. The message was simple and cruel. He said that humanity had sent a fishing boat to a warship gathering, and perhaps they should stay in the back, where they would be safe. The bridge of the Defiance went silent when that message came through. Lieutenant Susan Morgan, at the communication station, looked like she wanted to fire back a response, but Hayes simply raised one hand slightly. She understood and stayed quiet. Lieutenant Jake Miller, who served as the executive officer, stepped closer to Hayes and spoke in a low voice. He asked if they should respond to the insult. Hayes shook his head slowly and said that words meant nothing compared to actions and their time would come. Below the main deck in the engineering section, Paul Jennings worked with his team to run final diagnostics on the ship's primary weapon system. This system was known only as Project Longshot, and it was the most classified piece of technology humanity had ever developed. Only a handful of people in the entire coalition knew it existed, and none of the alien races had any idea what the Defiance truly carried. Jennings was a short man with graying hair and hands that were permanently stained with machine oil. He had spent 15 years helping to build the Longshot, and he knew every circuit and power relay like they were his own children. When his diagnostic panel showed green across all systems, he allowed himself a small smile. The weapon was ready, even if the galaxy was not. The military exercise was supposed to demonstrate unity among coalition forces against a common threat. That threat was called the Devourers, and they were unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. They consumed entire star systems and left nothing but dead space behind them. Intelligence reports suggested they were part organic and part machine, and that they operated like a hive mind. They had appeared on the galactic rim 5 years ago, and had been steadily pushing inward. Dozens of civilizations had already fallen. The coalition had formed primarily to stand against this threat, but right now the assembled fleet seemed more interested in showing off than preparing for actual combat. Hayes walked to the communications station and told Morgan to send a formal greeting to Admiral Zekthor. She composed a message that was polite and professional and sent it across all channels. The response came back within minutes. Zekthor acknowledged the human presence and assigned the Defiance to rear guard positions during the upcoming exercises. It was the kind of assignment you gave to ships you did not trust in actual combat. Hayes accepted without protest and ordered his crew to move into position. As the Defiance maneuvered toward the back of the formation, Karen watched her tactical display and counted the assembled forces. There were 12 different species represented here. The Korvax, with their plasma weapons. The Thrain Collective, who could bend space itself. The insectoid Vrex, who deployed swarms of hunter drones. The crystalline Shar, who fired beams of coherent light. Each race had technology that seemed almost magical compared to human engineering. Each race looked at the Defiance and saw primitives playing at war. In the Marine quarters, Sergeant Kyle Peterson sat with his squad and listened to the chatter coming through the ship's internal network. His Marines were angry. They had trained for years and knew what their ship could really do, but they had to sit here and take insults from aliens who had never seen humanity fight. One of his corporals asked why they did not just show these creatures what the Defiance was capable of. Peterson understood the feeling, but he also understood command decisions. He told his Marines that showing your hand too early was how you lost at poker, and this game was bigger than any of them could imagine. Night cycle came to the fleet, which was an artificial construct since there was no day or night in deep space. Ships dimmed their running lights, and crews rotated through rest periods. Hayes walked through the corridors of his ship and stopped at a sealed bulkhead that led to the long-shot weapon bay. Chief Petty Officer Lisa Grant stood guard there as she did every shift. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes, and she never left her post. When Hayes approached, she straightened slightly and asked if he needed to inspect the weapon. He shook his head and said he just wanted to see the door. She asked if they would ever use it. Hayes was quiet for a long moment before he answered. He said that the weapon would be used when circumstances demanded it, and not before. Pride was not a good enough reason to reveal what humanity had built in secret. The commander returned to his quarters and sat at his desk, where a small holographic display showed the tactical layout of the fleet. 53 warships from 12 species all gathered to practice fighting an enemy that was probably already on its way. He pulled up classified reports about the Devourers and read through attack patterns and casualty figures. Entire fleets had been wiped out. Entire worlds had gone silent. Whatever was coming would test every ship here, and he wondered if pride and mockery would seem important when the real fighting started. The joint exercise began at dawn cycle, with Admiral Zeke Thor broadcasting formation orders to all ships in the fleet. The alien vessels moved with practiced precision that came from centuries of military tradition, and their ships glowed with energy fields that made them look like moving stars. The Defiance kept pace with the formation, but its conventional thrusters and simple gray hull drew continued attention, and most of that attention came with laughter. Karen Bishop heard it all through the open channels, and her hands gripped her console edge hard enough to turn her knuckles white. Commander Hayes stood behind her and placed one hand briefly on her shoulder. He did not need to say anything. She understood and forced herself to relax. The first phase of the exercise involved basic maneuvers through an asteroid field that had been seeded with sensor buoys. Each ship was scored on speed and accuracy, and the results were displayed for all to see. The Korvax ships blazed through the course with their powerful engines. The Thrain vessels simply bent space around the asteroids and appeared on the other side without actually moving. The Vrex sent their drones ahead to map optimal paths. When the Defiance made its run, it relied on good piloting and careful navigation. The ship completed the course without hitting anything, but its time was middle of the pack. Zekthor broadcast a comment about how humans were at least competent at basic flying, even if their technology was outdated. The second phase involved target practice. Massive drone ships had been deployed at various ranges, and each fleet was asked to demonstrate their primary weapons against these targets. This was where the aliens really wanted to show off. The Korvax went first, and their plasma cannons lit up space like miniature suns. The target drones melted into slag within seconds, and the destruction was spectacular. 1. The other ships in the fleet broadcast congratulations, and Zekthor seemed pleased with himself. Next came the Thrain, who fired their dimensional disruptors. These weapons did not look like much until the target drones simply collapsed inward and disappeared. Space itself had been folded around them until they ceased to exist. The effect was quiet and terrifying. The Vrex launched their hunter swarms, which were thousands of small drones that moved like angry insects. They surrounded the target drones and stripped them down to nothing within minutes. The Shar fired beams of coherent light that burned through hulls like they were paper. Each demonstration brought cheers and boasts from the various species. Each demonstration was designed to impress and intimidate. When it was finally humanity's turn, the bridge of the Defiance was tense. Lieutenant Jake Miller asked Hayes what they should show. Hayes considered for a moment and then ordered a standard railgun demonstration. The Defiance's railguns were kinetic weapons that fired solid projectiles at extremely high velocities. They were old technology by galactic standards, but they were reliable and effective. Karen locked targeting and fired a spread of 6 rounds. The projectiles crossed the distance in seconds and punched through the target drones with precision. The drones broke apart and tumbled through space as debris. It was efficient, and it got the job done, but there was no flash or spectacle. The open channels filled with alien laughter. One of the Thrain commanders broadcast a message saying that humans still threw rocks like primitives. Zekthor added that the weapons were barely adequate for system defense and would be useless against real threats. Susan Morgan relayed these messages to Hayes with barely controlled anger in her voice. She asked permission to respond, but Hayes simply smiled slightly and told her to send a polite thank you to Admiral Zekthor for his valuable assessment. The sarcasm in his tone was subtle, but his bridge crew caught it, and some of them allowed themselves small grins. Hayes knew exactly what he was doing. Let them laugh now. Let them feel superior. It would make what came later that much more effective. Down in the engineering bay, Paul Jennings listened to the mockery through the ship's internal network and shook his head. His team had worked on the Longshot for years, and they knew what it could do. One of his younger engineers asked why they did not just demonstrate the real weapon and shut the aliens up. Jennings explained that revealing your best weapon during a practice exercise was foolish. You saved your ace for when the stakes were real. The engineer understood but still looked frustrated. Jennings told him that patience was part of being professional. The exercise continued through the day cycle with various drills and simulations. The Defiance performed adequately in all of them, but never spectacularly. Hayes kept his ship in the middle of every ranking and never pushed for the top scores. To outside observers, it looked like humanity was simply outclassed by more advanced civilizations. That was exactly what Hayes wanted them to think. In the Marine quarters, Kyle Peterson ran his squad through weapons, drills, and combat scenarios. His Marines were some of the toughest fighters humanity had produced, but right now they felt useless. They could hear the alien chatter and the constant insults about their ship. Peterson reminded them that Marines did not fight for glory or respect. They fought because it was their job, and they did it well, regardless of what anyone else thought. Evening cycle came and the fleet broke formation to rest and recharge. Ships drifted in a loose cluster and crews rotated through their rest periods. Hayes was in his ready room, reviewing the day's performance data when Jake Miller entered. The executive officer looked tired and frustrated. He asked Hayes how long they were going to let the aliens treat them like children. Hayes leaned back in his chair and explained that galactic politics was complicated. Humanity was new to this stage, and they had to be careful. Revealing the Longshot too soon could make the other races fearful instead of respectful. Fear led to alliances against you, and that was the last thing humanity needed. Miller understood the logic but said it was hard to watch. Hayes agreed and said it was hard to command, as well, but necessary. On the bridge, Karen ran through tactical simulations on her own time. She programmed scenarios where the Defiance faced various alien ships in combat and ran the numbers. With conventional weapons, the outcome was always the same. The Defiance would lose against any of the major warships in the fleet. But when she added the Longshot to the simulation, the results flipped dramatically. The weapon was devastating beyond anything the galaxy had seen in recent history. She saved her data and logged off, wondering when and if they would ever get to use it. Lisa Grant finished her shift guarding the Longshot bay and was relieved by another crew member. She made her way to the mess hall, where off-duty personnel gathered for meals and conversation. The mood was tense. People were angry about the disrespect and frustrated that they could not do anything about it. Grant understood, but she also trusted Hayes. She had served under him for 6 years and knew he always had a plan. She told a table of younger crew members that their time would come, and when it did, they needed to be ready. Her confidence helped settle some of the anger in the room. Hayes stood alone in the observation deck and watched the gathered fleet through the viewport. 53 warships representing the military might of 12 species, all preparing to face a threat that had destroyed countless civilizations. He thought about humanity's place in all this. They were the newcomers and the underdogs. They had been mocked and dismissed and placed in the back where they would be safe. But Hayes knew something the aliens did not. Humanity had a long history of being underestimated and an even longer history of proving the doubters wrong. The Longshot was just the latest example of human ingenuity born from necessity. He wondered what Zekthor and the others would think when they finally saw it. The alarms started at 0400 hours and shattered the quiet of night cycle across the entire fleet. Commander Hayes was awake and moving before the second alarm sounded. He reached the bridge in less than 3 minutes, still pulling on his uniform jacket. Karen Bishop was already at her station, with her face lit by the glow of her tactical display. She looked up when Hayes entered, and her expression told him everything he needed to know before she spoke. The Devourers were here. Long-range sensors had detected a massive spatial distortion approaching from the edge of the system. The distortion was moving at speeds that should not have been possible, and it was getting closer with every passing second. Hayes ordered full scans and damage assessment protocols. Within minutes, the data started coming in, and each new piece of information made the situation worse. The enemy force was enormous. Hundreds of contacts were emerging from the distortion, and they were all heading directly toward the Coalition fleet. Intelligence had predicted the Devourers would not arrive for at least another 3 days. Intelligence had been wrong. Admiral Zekthor's voice boomed across all channels, ordering every ship to battle stations. The mockery and arrogance from the previous day was gone, and replaced by cold military efficiency. The Korvax admiral began organizing the fleet into defensive formations, with the largest ships forming a front line and smaller vessels providing support. Hayes listened to the orders and noted that the Defiance was being assigned to rear guard again. This time, it was not an insult, but a tactical decision. Zekthor clearly believed the human ship would not survive frontline combat. Hayes accepted the assignment without comment and ordered his crew to prepare for battle. The Devourer fleet emerged from the spatial distortion like something out of a nightmare. Their ships were wrong in ways that were hard to describe. They looked organic with hulls that seemed to pulse and breathe. But they also had metallic components and energy signatures that suggested advanced technology. Each vessel was unique in design, as if they had been grown rather than built. They moved in perfect coordination, like cells in a single organism. Karen counted over 300 contacts, and the number kept climbing. She reported to Hayes that the enemy outnumbered the Coalition fleet 6-1. Jake Miller stood beside the command chair and watched the tactical display. He had read every report about the Devourers that human intelligence had gathered. He knew that entire fleets had been wiped out by these creatures. He knew that they consumed everything they touched and left only dead systems behind. He also knew that no one had ever beaten them in open combat. Every encounter had ended with retreat or annihilation. He asked Hayes if they should consider withdrawing. Hayes shook his head and said they came here to stand with their allies, and that was what they would do. The Devourer swarm crashed into the Coalition front line with terrifying speed and violence. The first exchange of fire lit up space like a second sun. The Korvax plasma cannons fired continuously, and the Thrain dimensional disruptors tore holes in reality. The Vreks launched their hunter swarms, and the Shar fired their light beams. Every weapon the Coalition had was thrown at the approaching enemy. For a moment it looked like the defensive line might hold. Then the Devourers adapted. The enemy ships began to absorb the energy weapons. Plasma, that should have melted their hulls, was instead drawn into their organic systems and used to power their own weapons. The dimensional distortions were shrugged off as if space meant nothing to them. The Vrex hunter drones were intercepted and reprogrammed mid-flight. Within minutes, they turned on their creators and began attacking Vrex ships. The Char light beams burned through some enemy vessels. But for every one destroyed, two more took its place. The Devourers fired back with weapons that defied understanding. They launched streams of corrosive matter that ate through shields like they were not there. When the matter touched hull plating, it spread like infection and consumed the metal. Ships that were hit began to dissolve from the outside in. Crew members screamed across open channels as their vessels died around them. The Coalition front line began to crumble. Karen tracked the battle from her station and felt cold fear settle into her stomach. The tactical display was turning red as ship after ship went offline. The Eternal Dominion was taking massive damage, and Zekthor was shouting orders to his fleet even as his own ship burned. 3 Thrain vessels had been completely consumed, and their final transmissions were recordings of terror. A dozen Vrex ships were tearing apart their own formation under Devourer control. The battle had been going for less than 15 minutes, and already the Coalition was losing badly. Paul Jennings watched his engineering displays and saw that the fleet's power signatures were dropping across the board. Ships were burning out their generators, trying to maintain shields and weapons. The Devourers seemed to have unlimited energy, and they pressed their advantage without mercy. One of his engineers asked if the Longshot could help. Jennings looked at the sealed bulkhead that led to the weapon bay and said that decision was above his pay grade. But he began running activation protocols, just in case. Susan Morgan monitored communication channels and heard desperation spreading through the fleet. Ship captains were calling for reinforcements that did not exist. Some were suggesting retreat. Others were simply screaming. She filtered through the chaos and relayed critical information to Hayes. The commander stood motionless at the center of his bridge and absorbed every piece of data. His face was calm, but his eyes were calculating. He was waiting for something. A Devourer ship broke through the Coalition front line and made directly for the Defiance. It was a massive creature, 3 times the size of the human vessel, with tentacle-like appendages that writhed in space. Karen locked weapons, but Hayes told her to hold fire. The enemy ship came closer. 200 meters. 100. 50. The entire bridge crew tensed. Hayes watched the approaching horror and then quietly asked Jake Miller if it was time. Miller looked at his commander and nodded once. Hayes opened a ship-wide channel so that every member of his crew could hear him. His voice was steady and filled with quiet authority. He said that humanity had come to the stars not to prove they were better than anyone else, but to stand together against the darkness. For 3 years they had been tested and judged, and found wanting by species that did not understand them. Today was the day that changed. Today humanity would show the galaxy what they were truly capable of. Today they would fulfill the promise they made when they joined the Coalition. He ordered all non-essential crew to brace for weapons discharge, and then he turned to Karen. She knew what was coming, and her hands moved across her controls with practiced speed. She called down to engineering and told Paul Jennings to begin the activation sequence for Project Longshot. There was a pause, and then Jennings acknowledged. Deep in the ship, systems began to wake up. Power flowed through circuits that had never been used in combat. Magnetic containment fields activated. Quantum processors calculated trajectories that accounted for relativistic effects. The Longshot was coming online. The Devourer ship attached itself to the Defiance's hull and began to cut through the outer plating with its corrosive weapons. Damage alarms blared across the bridge. Lisa Grant and her Marines rushed to the breach point with weapons ready to repel boarders. The ship shuddered as sections of hull plating dissolved. Hayes ignored it all. He was focused on the tactical display where Karen had calculated a firing solution that would take the Longshot straight through the heart of the enemy swarm. Jennings reported that the weapon was charged and ready. The power drain was enormous, and every light on the ship dimmed. Hayes looked at Karen and gave the order. She entered the firing command. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. Then reality itself seemed to scream in protest as the USS Defiance fired its secret weapon for the first time in combat. The forward section of the Defiance split open as armored plating retracted to reveal the barrel of the long-shot weapon system. It was a massive device that ran nearly a third of the ship's length and was lined with power conduits that glowed bright blue. The weapon did not look like plasma cannons or energy projectors. It looked wrong and unnatural, as if it bent the rules of physics just by existing. Every sensor in the Coalition fleet suddenly focused on the human ship as energy signatures spiked to levels that should have been impossible for a vessel that small. Karen Bishop's hands moved across her tactical console with absolute precision. The firing solution she had calculated was perfect. The long shot would fire in a straight line through the densest part of the Devourer swarm. The targeting computer compensated for ship movement and relativistic effects and a dozen other factors that could throw the shot off by even a fraction of a degree. She locked the solution and transferred it to the weapon control. Paul Jennings in engineering watched his displays and saw that every system was green. The long shot was ready. The weapon did not fire energy or projectiles in any conventional sense. What it created was something far more terrifying. Deep in the heart of the device, quantum fields collapsed matter into a point smaller than an atom. The result was a microscopic black hole that existed for only a fraction of a second before it would normally evaporate. But the long shot did not let it evaporate. Instead, it contained the singularity in a quantum field and accelerated it to nearly the speed of light. When the field was released, the black hole would travel in a straight line, consuming everything in its path until it finally destabilized. The theory was sound. The simulations had been successful. But this was the first time anyone had fired it at full power in combat. Commander Hayes gave the order, and Karen pressed the firing control. For a moment, the entire ship went dark, as every available watt of power was channeled into the weapon. Then a beam of absolute darkness erupted from the Defiance's bow. It was not black, like the absence of light. It was something deeper and more fundamental. It was the absence of everything. Space itself seemed to tear along the beam's path. The Devourer ship that was attached to their hull was the first to die. The creature simply ceased to exist as the singularity passed through it. There was no explosion or debris. One moment it was there, and the next, there was nothing but empty space. The beam continued forward and punched into the Devourer swarm. Ships that had survived everything the Coalition could throw at them were torn apart at the atomic level. The singularity did not care about shields or armor or adaptive biology. Everything that touched it was compressed into a point of infinite density for a microsecond before being released as radiation. The beam carved through the enemy formation like it was not there. Dozens of ships vanished, then hundreds. The destruction was total and absolute, and it happened faster than most sensors could track. Admiral Zekthor watched from his burning flagship as a line of nothing cut through the enemy fleet. His forearms hung limp at his sides as his mind tried to process what he was seeing. The human ship that he had mocked as primitive had just deployed a weapon that made everything else in the system look like children's toys. He ordered his sensor officer to analyze the attack, but the officer reported that their instruments could barely measure what was happening. The energy readings were off every scale they had. Zekthor felt something he had not experienced in decades of combat. He felt genuine fear. The long-shot beam traveled for thousands of kilometers before the quantum containment finally failed. When it did, the singularity released all its captured energy at once. The flash was blinding across every spectrum. Gamma radiation burst outward in a sphere that would have been lethal to any ship nearby. But there were no ships nearby because everything in that area had already been consumed by the beam. The flash faded and left behind a perfectly straight line of empty space where hundreds of Devourer vessels had been only seconds before. On the Defiance, the bridge crew sat in stunned silence. Karen stared at her tactical display, where a huge section of the enemy swarm had simply disappeared. The computer was struggling to update the battlefield map because it could not believe its own sensors. Jake Miller was the first to speak, and he asked if that really just happened. Hayes allowed himself a small smile and said that, yes, it had. He ordered damage reports and a status check on the long shot. Paul Jennings was already working on that. The weapon bay was filled with smoke, and sparks flew from overloaded circuits. The long shot had functioned exactly as designed, but the power requirements had burned out half the systems in the process. His team was moving through the bay with fire suppression equipment and emergency repair kits. Jennings pulled up diagnostic data and saw that the weapon's main coils were fused, and the quantum field generators were completely destroyed. He opened a channel to the bridge and reported that the long shot had fired once and would never fire again without a complete rebuild. Hayes acknowledged and said that one shot had been enough. The remaining Devourer ships seemed confused and disoriented. The swarm intelligence that had coordinated them so perfectly was disrupted by the sudden loss of so many units. They broke formation and scattered in different directions. Some tried to flee back toward the spatial distortion they had emerged from. Others continued attacking, but without coordination. The coalition fleet, which had been on the verge of annihilation, suddenly found itself facing a broken and leaderless enemy. Zekthor's voice boomed across all channels, ordering every ship to press the attack. The tide of battle had turned. The Korvax plasma cannons found their targets easily now. The Thrain dimensional disruptors collapsed enemy ships, one by one. The Vrex managed to regain control of some of their hunter drones and sent them after fleeing Devourers. The Shar light beams burned through confused enemy vessels. What had been a desperate fight for survival became a coordinated execution. The coalition forces moved through the scattered enemy fleet, destroying everything they found. Within an hour, the battle was over. Of the massive Devourer swarm that had attacked, only debris remained. Hayes walked to the viewport and looked out at the battlefield. The space around them was filled with wreckage from both sides. He counted 8 coalition ships that had been completely destroyed and another 20 that were heavily damaged. The Eternal Dominion was still intact, but barely. Its hull was scorched, and sections were open to space. But they had won. Against an enemy that had never been defeated in open combat, the coalition had won. And they had won because of one shot from one human ship. A communication request came through from Admiral Zekthor. Susan Morgan looked to Hayes, who nodded. The channel opened, and the Korvax Admiral's face appeared on the main screen. His scales were dulled by fire damage, and one of his arms hung useless at his side. But his eyes were clear and focused directly on Hayes. For a long moment, neither commander spoke. Then Zekthor did something that shocked his own crew. He lowered his head in a gesture of respect. He said that he had underestimated humanity, and he had been wrong. He formally apologized for the disrespect he had shown to the Defiance and her crew. Hayes inclined his head slightly and said that humanity understood the need for new species to prove themselves. He thanked the Admiral for the opportunity to stand alongside their allies. The rest of the coalition fleet began sending messages. Some were congratulations. Some were requests for information about the weapon. Some were simply expressions of shock. Hayes had Susan respond to all of them with the same message. The Defiance and her crew had done their duty as members of the coalition. Nothing more and nothing less. He did not gloat or boast. He simply acknowledged their messages and promised that humanity would continue to stand with them against any threat. Karen ran system diagnostics and reported that they had taken significant damage from the Devourer attack, but nothing critical. The hull breaches were being sealed, and life support was stable. The Longshot Bay was a mess, but the rest of the ship was functional. They could make it to the nearest starbase for repairs. Hayes ordered her to set a course and then told Jake Miller to assemble the senior staff. They had won the battle, but there was still much to discuss. The aftermath of the battle stretched for hours as coalition ships worked to secure the area and recover survivors from damaged vessels. The Defiance maintained its position in the formation, while repair teams worked to seal hull breaches and restore damaged systems. Commander Hayes stood in his ready room with his senior staff gathered around the conference table. Karen Bishop sat with exhaustion written across her face, but her eyes were still sharp. Jake Miller had a bandage on his forehead from where debris had hit him during the battle. Paul Jennings looked like he had been through a fire, which was not far from the truth given the state of the Longshot Bay. Susan Morgan and Lisa Grant completed the group. Hayes began by congratulating them on their performance during the battle. Every member of the crew had done their duty under extreme circumstances, and the ship had survived against odds that would have destroyed most vessels. He then addressed the elephant in the room, which was what happened next. The galaxy had just seen humanity deploy a weapon that changed the balance of power. Questions would be asked. Demands would be made. Some species would want the technology. Others would want it destroyed. Humanity's position in the coalition, and in galactic politics, had fundamentally shifted in the span of a few seconds. Karen spoke first and said that the other races would never look at them the same way again. The mockery was gone, but it had been replaced by something else. Fear and respect were close cousins, and both could lead to complicated situations. Jake agreed, and added that they needed to be careful about how they handled diplomatic requests. Paul said that from a technical standpoint, the long shot could not be easily replicated. The quantum field equations alone had taken human scientists 30 years to solve. Even if they shared the plans, most species would need decades to understand them. Lisa reported that her Marines had received communications from several alien military units asking about human ground combat capabilities. Apparently, if their ships were this advanced, then their soldiers might be equally dangerous. She found it amusing since human Marines were actually less technologically advanced than most galactic species. But perception was everything in politics. Susan had monitoring diplomatic channels and said that at least 8 species had formally requested technology sharing agreements. 3 others wanted mutual defense pacts. 1 species had requested permission to send observers to study human military doctrine. Hayes listened to all of this and considered their options. Humanity had to walk a careful line now. They needed to be strong enough that no one would attack them, but not so threatening that others would form alliances against them. They had proven they could build devastating weapons. Now they needed to prove they could be trusted with them. He told his staff that their official position would be simple. The Longshot was a defensive weapon built to protect coalition members against existential threats like the Devourers. Humanity had no intention of using it for conquest or intimidation. They would share general principles of the technology with trusted allies, but the specific implementation would remain classified for security reasons. The meeting ended, and the staff returned to their duties. Hayes remained in his ready room and pulled up casualty reports from the battle. 8 coalition ships destroyed. Over 4,000 lives lost. The Defiance had suffered 12 casualties when the Devourer ship breached their hull. 12 people who had families and friends and futures. The victory was real. But the cost was also real. Hayes made a note to personally contact the families of every crew member they had lost. Hours later, the Coalition fleet began moving toward the nearest starbase. The Eternal Dominion led the formation, but its pace was slow because of the damage it had sustained. The Defiance took up a position in the middle of the fleet, and this time, it was not because anyone thought the humans needed protection. A full honor guard of 12 ships surrounded them. It was a gesture of respect and recognition. Karen noted the formation change and showed it to Hayes, who nodded but said nothing. Admiral Zekthor requested another communication with Hayes. This time, the Korvax admiral was in his quarters rather than on his bridge. He looked tired, and his injured arm was in a medical brace. He told Hayes that he had been fighting wars for over a century, and he had seen weapons that could crack planets and shields that could stop stars. But he had never seen anything like the Longshot. He asked Hayes directly if humanity had always possessed this capability. Hayes was honest and said yes. They had completed the weapon 3 years ago, shortly after joining the Coalition, but had kept it classified. Zekthor asked why they had not revealed it sooner. Hayes explained that humanity was new to galactic politics and did not want to be seen as a threat. They wanted to be partners and allies. Revealing a weapon of that magnitude too early could have made other species fearful or hostile. The Admiral considered this and said it was a wise approach, even if it had required enduring mockery and disrespect. He asked if humanity had other weapons they were keeping secret. Hayes smiled slightly and said that every military had secrets and humanity was no exception. Zekthor laughed at that and said he understood. He ended the communication by saying that he looked forward to working with humanity as equals. The journey to the starbase took 3 days. During that time, the Defiance received constant communications from other ships. Some wanted to thank them. Some wanted to ask questions. Some just wanted to see the ship that had saved the fleet. Hayes handled each communication with professional courtesy and made sure his crew understood that they were representing all of humanity. Their behavior now would affect how Earth and its colonies were treated for generations to come. Paul Jennings spent those 3 days in the Longshot Bay with his engineering team. The weapon was completely destroyed and would need to be rebuilt from scratch. It would take months in a proper shipyard and cost a fortune. But they had proven the concept worked. The Longshot had fired once and erased an entire fleet. That single shot had accomplished what hundreds of conventional weapons could not. Jennings sat among the burned-out circuits and melted conduits and felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. His creation had saved thousands of lives but had also demonstrated humanity's capacity for destruction. Karen spent her off-duty time analyzing the battle data. She wanted to understand exactly what the Longshot had done and how effective it had been. The numbers were staggering. The weapon had eliminated 347 enemy vessels in 0.6 seconds. The energy output had been equivalent to a small star. The precision had been perfect. She wrote up a detailed tactical report that would be classified at the highest levels but would also inform future military planning. She ended the report with a recommendation that humanity develop more ships with similar capabilities. One Defiance had changed a battle. A fleet of them could change the galaxy. When they finally reached the starbase, it was clear that word had spread. The docking area was crowded with ships from dozens of species, and every external camera seemed to be pointed at the Defiance. Hayes ordered the crew to maintain professional bearing and not to discuss the weapon with anyone outside the command structure. They docked smoothly and began the process of offloading wounded and arranging for repairs. Hayes was informed that representatives from 7 different species wanted to meet with him. He accepted and scheduled meetings for the following day. That evening, Hayes stood in the observation deck and looked out at the stars. Jake Miller found him there and stood quietly beside him. They watched ships moving through the starbase and listened to the hum of the station around them. Miller finally broke the silence and said that everything had changed. Hayes agreed. Humanity had come to the galaxy 3 years ago as newcomers. They had been tested and mocked and dismissed. Now they were respected and perhaps feared. The question was what kind of civilization they would become with this new status. Miller asked what Hayes thought would happen next. Hayes said that other threats would come. The Devourers were just one danger among many. The galaxy was a big place filled with species that had their own agendas and conflicts. Humanity would need to navigate all of it carefully. They had proven they could build powerful weapons. Now they needed to prove they had the wisdom to use them responsibly. Miller said that was a heavy burden. Hayes smiled and said that heavy burdens were what made people strong. The repairs on the Defiance would take weeks. The crew would have time to rest and recover. Some would receive medals. Some would be promoted. All of them would carry the knowledge that they had been part of something historic. They had fired the shot that changed humanity's place in the galaxy. They had proven that being underestimated was sometimes an advantage. They had shown that quiet competence was more powerful than loud boasting. Hayes returned to his quarters late that night and sat at his desk to write his official report. He detailed the battle from beginning to end and included his assessment of the Longshot's performance. He recommended that similar weapons be installed on other human vessels, but also warned against over-reliance on any single technology. He noted that the real strength of the Defiance had not been the weapon but the crew who operated it. Training and discipline had been as important as firepower. He ended the report with a personal observation. Humanity had been mocked for sending what appeared to be a weak warship to the Coalition exercise. The aliens had laughed at their primitive technology and questioned whether humans belonged in space at all. Then, the Defiance had fired once and erased an entire fleet. The lesson was clear. Appearances could be deceiving. Underestimating an opponent because they looked different or used different technology was a mistake that could be fatal. The galaxy had learned that lesson. At the Battle of Epsilon Sector, Hayes submitted the report and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring meetings and negotiations and politics. But tonight, he could rest knowing that his crew had done something remarkable. They had stood against impossible odds and won. They had represented humanity with courage and skill, and they had ensured that no one would ever mock a human warship again. The Defiance had earned its name and its place in history. The shot that erased a fleet would echo through the galaxy for generations to come.